Climate is too often perceived in political terms, red versus blue. Scientists are largely agreed. There are a few who dissent, but there's a consensus that human activity has, through carbon emissions, has created the problems we now confront. We don't actually need scientists to tell us that things are changing. I live in a city where 16 of the 17 hottest years on record have occurred since 2000. I live next to what we call the Sound, that's the Atlantic Ocean between Long Island and Connecticut, where the water is rising, the land is actually sinking a little bit, but it's rising at the rate of about 1.5 inches every decade. And you might think that's pretty slow, but as that goes on, when you have a hurricane, the surges become deadly. There are 55,000 homes in the state of Connecticut that are in danger of coastal flooding. And by 2050, there'll be another 30,000 according to the latest estimates. Now, think about that in a practical way. When those homes are all damaged, who pays for it? And when they cannot be rebuilt, who will make up the property tax loss of all of those homes? Connecticut's not the only state with a coast. Georgia has a rather famous coast itself. You face those same quandaries. We are aware of the changes that we face. But you might ask, what does all this have to do with religion? Well, sacred stories of creation make it obvious that we humans are part of creation. And if you follow the biblical record, as I do as a Christian, but you could be Jewish, you could be a Muslim if you hold this text sacred, we're not only part of creation, we are charged with being responsible for creation. More, we cannot misuse creation and then with impunity and ask our children and grandchildren and their children to clean up the mess that we create. Intergenerational equity requires that we take responsibility in the present. And finally, those who suffer most are those who can least afford to do anything about this. I have a good friend who is Commodore of the Yacht Club of Greenwich. They redid it and raised it 6 feet. I'm not too worried about the people in Greenwich who are members of the Yacht Club, but I am worried about a whole group of communities along the Connecticut coast where people live and they don't have the resources to move, let alone to change anything about the structures where they live. I'd like to quote Gus Spieth, who's the former dean of the School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences, who said this very well. Gus said, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those issues, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists do not know how to do that. That is the business of religion, and that is why we are here tonight." We are very blessed to have with us a great panel and an expert moderator, John Sawyer. And yes, he's the brother of Chris Sawyer, who helped to recruit him for this event. John is a Yale College alum who's had a most impressive career in media coverage. He spent 31 years with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch before becoming the founding executive director of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. During his years working for the Post-Dispatch, he won the National Press Club's prize for Best Foreign Reporting 3 years in a row. Since moving to the Pulitzer Center, he has led the center to an Emmy for a documentary, the Asian Society's Goldman Sachs Foundation Prize for Best Use of Technology in International Education, and Best Online Journalism prizes from a range of organizations. He has turned the attention of the center to climate change, including major features for the New York Times Magazine, PBS NewsHour, and The New Yorker. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce our moderator for this evening's discussion, John Sawyer.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's really an honor to be here, to be in this distinguished company. And of course, it's always a pleasure to do something with my brother, Chris. He's taught me everything I know from a very early age about pursuing a goal, about making things happen, and also about having a good time along the way. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Pulitzer Center and then just some opening thoughts, and then we'll turn to this wonderful panel, and we'll each do, I think, fairly short opening comments and to sort of set this discussion going, and I'll have a few questions, we'll have some conversation here, and then turn as quickly as you all seem ready and eager with questions to your thoughts, and so we'll have as much conversation as we can. At the Pulitzer Center, we've been funding reporting and educational outreach on climate almost from the time we began back in 2006. 4 years ago, we co-sponsored with Mary Evelyn Tucker from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies a conference in Beijing on religion and the environment. It was a really remarkable gathering, bringing together 75 religious leaders, business people, scientists, academics, and journalists. A year later, we added the Yale Forestry School to the Pulitzer Center's campus consortium, a group now totaling 35 universities and community colleges across the nation, including, I'm happy to say, Spelman and Clark right here in Atlanta. And each of those organize campus visits by Pulitzer Center journalists and Pulitzer reporting fellowships for students. Last summer, we partnered with the New York Times on a full issue of the magazine called Losing Earth. That was a book-length essay by Nathaniel Rich, photographs by George Steinmetz from all over the world, making the case that climate will never be properly addressed until we recognize the deeply moral issues at its core. And we've organized events at nearly 25 schools and universities across the United States on that project, including at Yale and at the Global Climate Action Summit last September in San Francisco, to bring that work to the widest possible audience. In the fall, we commissioned a 4-part series for PBS NewsHour with Sam Eaton on the Amazon at the tipping point. We've also launched in the last few months the Rainforest Journalism Fund, 40-plus projects a year over the next 5 years, aiming to raise the visibility of this issue in all of the rainforest basins of South America, Asia, and Africa, with funding from the Norwegian Ministry of the Environment, trying also to build capacity among the journalists of those affected regions. I hope we'll have time to say more about some of these initiatives in our discussion or in response to your questions, but I want to use my time now for something else, to talk about a 16-year-old Swedish girl named Greta Thunberg. I'm just curious, how many people here know about Greta Thunberg? A few. I'm sorry to say that I didn't until very recently. She is the Swedish 16-year-old who started what has become a global school strike for climate. I found out about her because I think it's really important to talk about her, because I think it speaks so directly, her story, to the topic of our meeting, of getting beyond despair and denial and facing climate change with moral urgency and hope. I heard about her because of a feature in The New Yorker by Masha Gessen, who happens to be a Pulitzer Center grantee, who usually writes about Russia and Ukraine. This week, The Guardian ran a wonderful interview with Greta by environment editor John Watts, who is also the chair of our Amazon Advisory Committee with the Rainforest Journalism Fund. Jonathan's story led me to the TEDx talk that Greta gave last fall. And I hope that everyone who hasn't seen it or heard about her go straight home and watch tonight, because it's an amazing piece. You'll see that Greta Thunberg is an exceedingly unlikely leader of such a cause. A young woman diagnosed with Asperger's, someone obsessed since the age of 8 with the realities of climate change and the failure of the world's governments and most people to take meaningful action about it. Last August, she decided to act herself, skipping school to protest in front of Parliament Sweden's failure to meet the climate commitments it had made in Paris 4 years ago. One of her inspirations came from America, the students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, who began the March for Our Lives movement for gun control. Greta's been protesting every Friday since, and in the intervening months, thousands of students have joined her cause from all across Europe to Uganda and Australia, and now the United States as well. This coming Friday, we're likely to see protests by students in some 71 countries, including, I gather, here in Atlanta at Piedmont Park Friday afternoon. She is making a difference, among other things, standing next to European Union Chief Executive Jean-Claude Juncker 3 weeks ago, as he pledged to spend a quarter of the EU's budget, hundreds of billions of euros, on climate mitigation. At the end of her TED Talk, Greta said, this is where people usually start talking about hope, solar panels, wind power, circular economy, and so on. But I'm not going to do that. We've had 30 years of pep talk and selling solutions, and I'm sorry, but it doesn't work. If it did, the emissions would have gone down by now. They haven't. And yes, we do need hope. Of course we do. But the one thing we need more than hope is action. Once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So instead of looking for hope, look for action. Then and only then will hope come. And she went on to say, today we use 100 million barrels of oil every single day. There are no politics to change that. There are no rules to keep that oil in the ground. We can't save the world by playing by the rules because the rules need to change. Everything needs to be changed, and it has to start today. You have to picture when you see her, those of you who haven't, she's about 4'9" or 10. She's tiny, and she speaks in sort of not quite a monotone, but she's very intense, and she knows what she's talking about. And I don't think I've ever seen a TED-style talk that was more captivating. But listening to her, watching her, I think about the power of individuals, also of faith communities, of the far lit by people like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Ruby Bridges, and also the crucial role played by organizations, whether it's the Interfaith Power and Light movement, the Yale School of Forestry, or the Yale Divinity School. We're lucky to have leaders from each here tonight, and I want to turn down to first Corey Norred, the program director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. So Corey.
Good evening, everybody. What do we do now? This is the question that I spend the majority of my time thinking about. This is the question that draws us here this evening. The question, what do we do now, is inherently motivated by how important we think the work of climate change is. The extent, both morally and practically, that environmental ethics and justice are woven into the fabric of what it means to be faithful in our variety of traditions. So again, my name is Codi Norred, and I serve as the program director for Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. For 15 years, Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, GIPL, has worked with congregations to support and equip them to engage in conversations of sustainability, both theologically and practically. That looks like a lot of different things. It looks like equipping congregations to build green teams and sustainability teams at the grassroots level. It looks like energy efficiency and solar. I think most importantly for this evening, perhaps, it means equipping congregations, lay leaders, individuals, faith leaders to engage in the public square in advocacy and policy change, in working with their neighbors to create plans to put pressure for change. All of these practical answers to what can we do or what do we do now are rooted in moral and theological frameworks that speak to why caring for creation is important. And ultimately, I believe this is the most important thing that we can do, which is to make clear for people the connections between environmental sustainability, creation care, climate change, etc., and how those ideas relate to their faith, our faiths, the morals we already possess, and our daily lives. How do we bring it to the present in a way that moves us towards faithful environmental action? Theologians David Orr and Dr. Jennifer Ayers of Candler talk a lot about place-based ecological religious education, that you must be rooted in a place. The idea that you can't love all of creation, and I would posit care about climate change at all, until you learn to love a particular place, till you become involved in your backyard in a practical way, morality that can be made practical, relatable, and acted upon. And the reality is that environmental ethics and environmental justice sit at the intersection of all of the ethical issues that we already care about. Most of our congregations already care about. For me, my training at Candler was primarily rooted in international peace building before I got into ecology. And international peace building and that conflict resolution revolves a lot around resource depletion, resource mismanagement from climate change, migration and immigration, climate change, public health, environmental justice, environmental inequity for both low-income communities and low-wealth communities are rooted in these environmental conversations. Climate change sits at the intersection of all of the issues that many of our communities already care about. Land, one of the foundations of many religious traditions, lies at the heart of our disenfranchisement of indigenous people and our continued raping of the world in a variety of ways. So climate and creation care sits at this intersection, and so a holistic approach must be taken into consideration when we work in these issues. We must articulate clearly the injustices that our systems of power and privilege work very hard to keep us blind to, so that we can notice, so that we can organize, so that we can effectively mobilize for change. The effects of climate change are too often talked about in ways that are very far away. I appreciated what you said about the place that you live at and the effects that climate change are having on the area that you live. The reality is that it is happening in our neighborhoods. And I will be clear here, and I will stick to my script so that I do not preach. When we turn on the lights in this room to have this discussion about climate change, we are killing our neighbors faster because of the way that we produce energy in this state. When congregations around this state go to prayer, or they break fast, or they proclaim the gospel of the resurrection, they kill their neighbor faster because of the systems of energy that perpetuate our holy practices. We have to understand that and draw that down. It's practical, it's happening, we're complicit in it, we're bound up in it. So what can we do? We can demonstrate how interconnected we all are. We can understand how these energy systems affect us. We can root the values of environmental stewardship in the myths that we already hold sacred, to love God and to love neighbor. We can make clear the intersections for people and provide clear paths for action. And we can ultimately reclaim the prophetic imagination that exists in all of our traditions. We can reclaim the theological place in the public square to make change and to lead from a moral lens, because there have always been prophets in cities and gardeners in the farm. And so I'm encouraged by your presence. I hope this panel will serve as an inspiration to you. These people serve as inspirations to me, to teach, to preach, to march, to affect policy change at the local level, to be prophetic, to be creative, and most of all, to be faithful. Thank you.
Thank you, Codi. Next, my leader and guide on all things religion and climate, Mary Evelyn Tucker, co-director of the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale.
Thank you, John, Codi, Clifton, Dean, Greg, and Gail, and Tom, and Chris, and so many people, our host here, Sam. Thank you. I want to begin actually by drawing in the fact that we're in Atlanta, Atlanta being one of the great homes of the civil rights movement. I was very moved a few years ago when I was here for the American Academy of Religion to go over to Ebenezer Baptist Church and listen to these beautiful sermons of Martin Luther King. I sat there weeping because I was very involved as a college student in Washington, D.C., at the same college actually Nancy Pelosi went to. And we were extremely concerned about civil rights and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I remember clearly the day Martin Luther King was shot. I was working on the Poor People's Campaign on 14th Street in D.C., and I will never forget the National Guard and the troops and the tanks moving in close to the Capitol. It was chilling. And of course, at that time, Detroit exploded, LA exploded. Some of these cities, especially like Detroit, never recovered. Or it's recovering now, but I would say what was so moving to me is when the religious communities, Martin Luther King, Abernathy, people like Ella Baker, and many others, John Lewis, when they came on board and said, this is a moral issue, things began to change. Because many of you, like me, grew up in a society that said segregation was okay, separate but equal, no problem. But that wasn't okay, because we grew up in an apartheid society, separate and unequal. And that kind of segregation that still lives with us is part of what we are overcoming on a number of ranges, and why I see the civil rights movement and the religion and ecology movement in a continuum. Because what King was saying even then, we need not segregation but integration. We need something that brings people together. He also made magnificent statements about the environment because he saw what was happening. He understood this combination of militarism, industrialism, and racism, and the environment. And that's where we are now, as well as Codi just referred to it. So this notion of a moral force that was fierce, that was firm, unstoppable, courageous, what we all seek right now in our moments of despair, and I have been writing about this for 40 years, I can assure you, because of my teacher, Thomas Berry, who was so prescient and understood we were going to see breakdown of institutions, political, social, economic, religious, and educational, and that's what we are seeing. But we have to find the resources for hope, just as the civil rights movement did. So this notion, then, our moment, the sense of denial, the denial of 50 and 60 years ago was the denial of segregation was okay. Separation was okay. We are at the same moment of denial that segregation of humans and the earth is okay. It's a worldview that we have, and it's just fine, and we can have our gated communities in Greenwich or whatever, and inner city, Flint, Michigan, and so on. What are we talking about? Water as sacred, water as life, which is what Standing Rock and Native Americans know well and why they are so significant in terms of this movement of religion and ecology. So, my plea here is, if we are going to move between denial and despair, denial of our profound interconnectedness to these forces of life, sacred, extraordinary forces of life that have birthed all of the Earth community, if we are going to come back to that sense of our senses and who we are as Homo sapiens in search of the wisdom of our last name, we are going to have to draw on the deepest forces of hope humans have ever sought for. Let me conclude by just saying, and I'm happy to say more as everyone will hear, our sources of hope come from, I think, those of us who are privileged to teach. They come from the next generation. Our students at Yale, at the Divinity School and the Forestry School are absolutely remarkable, unstoppable figures dealing with their own nightmares of what's going to happen and what is already happening with Katrinas and Sandys and $260 billion of destruction. They are dealing with these nightmares, and yet they have hope. My other source of hope is being in a place like this, being with you, some of you who are saying you want to retire and devote yourself to this with climate reality and so on, other groups like that. Religious leaders, laity, and each one of you can begin to contribute voices to the moral force that is arising everywhere. And the good news is, so young people, religious communities, leaders, and laity, the scientists are asking us to join them as never before. They know, and people like Gus Beth brought us to Yale because he knew that science, policy, law, and economics are necessary but not sufficient. This fierce moral force is what needs to come in like a leaven, like a yeast. And that's what gives us hope. So I invite us against all odds to hope that tells us we are not alone in these great ecosystems that have been birthed for 14 billion years of evolutionary creativity, 4.6 billion years of Earth's creativity, and we are here to continue these forces of life and that great creativity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Evelyn. And last, Clifton Granby, Assistant Professor of Ethics and Philosophy at the Yale Divinity School. Clifton.
Thank you, John, Codi, and Mary Evelyn. Thanks to all of you who played a role in hosting us. This is a wonderful occasion. It's good to be here, and our being here tonight actually gives me hope. In thinking through the moral urgency of climate change, I was reminded of a quote from the esteemed 20th century playwright Lorraine Hansberry, who, with the plight of African Americans living under racial oppression in mind, observed this: that no matter how much one despairs, when one confronts such facts, one must do so. Because this matter, and I really want to draw attention to this quote, this matter of admitting the true nature of a problem before setting about rectifying it or even pretending to is of utmost importance. I think this warning applies to climate change as well. And so what I want to focus on very briefly this evening are some of the sources of our collective refusal to acknowledge the vastness, the scope and scale of our ecological crisis. And I think in order to do this, the first thing we have to admit is that there's a tendency among all of us toward a certain kind of moral evasion. And in order to confront this evasion, so much depends on the quality of our engagement. But what I want to suggest is that as soon as we examine some of the causes of climate denial and indifference, of environmental apathy and ignorance, the larger mechanics and forces that have contributed to the Earth's demise quickly come into view. Climate denial is intimately bound up with the fact that the forces which unleash the modernization of the West were also tied to the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their land, a fact that is often denied. To refuse that history is to refuse to take seriously what has already been done on this land and to the people who inhabited it. Climate denial, climate evasion is just an extension of this much larger, this much longer pattern of denial. In that sense, it's really nothing new. Now, another thing that makes and that marks our contemporary moment is the sense that we are constantly in a state of crisis. There's the crisis that's presently unfolding, the crisis that was narrowly avoided, and the impending doom that is always to come. There's the crisis that would have happened if the banks didn't receive bailouts, or the crisis that was to come, or that is to come if the Department of Defense doesn't dominate federal spending bills. And of course, there's always the constantly unfolding constitutional crisis of democracy, which is, well, ongoing. This nagging sense of crisis makes it difficult to widen our moral sphere of concern beyond what is immediate, proximate, practical, and near. And all of this encourages not just denial of climate change, but often an awareness that doesn't lead to meaningful action or to a significant change in attitudes, behaviors, or policies. Now, this rush to the practical, the allure of accepting the terms of what those in power would tell us is most practical. This also distracts from our paying attention to slower forms, less visible forms of violence that happen at different rates. We can think of lead-filled drinking water that affects children, or hog waste seeping into crops and water supplies long after floodwaters have receded. Part of what I'm suggesting is that we have to move beyond this fixation with the spectacle. And we really have to focus our capacities of attentiveness and to cultivate a kind of sensitivity that pierces through the noise. Part of that noise is this sense that we're constantly in a state of crisis, and that constantly being in a state of crisis therefore justifies the machinations and the systems that are presently in place. I want to push back against that tonight. Related to this is this sense that each of us seems to always occupy a more pressing position of vulnerability. So it's not just climate change that we need to worry about, it's economic precarity. It's the fact that many of us inhabit communities that are already in peril, lack of education, lack of health care, and so forth. For this reason, seriously focusing on climate change means that these wider causes of economic precarity and vulnerability must also be addressed. Otherwise, we can only genuinely expect more evasions. Part of what is needed then, I want to suggest, is a mode of ethical and historical reckoning that acknowledges the underside of industrialization, the darkness of unfettered capitalism, and the ugliness of any morality that is more sensitive to the market than to the earth. But we also have to devise ways for persons to be able to earn a meaningful wage, preferably alongside caring for the earth. And this will require all of us to organize our lives around common, yet presently unimaginable goods. Not profit margins, not competition, not access, but genuinely shared goods held in common. This will require us to tell different stories about ourselves, about the land, about what flourishing in community looks like. Different stories about the nourishment that might make itself available through vulnerability and interconnectedness. It will require us to jettison our desires for sovereignty and dominion. And we'll also have to make quite a big room for lament, because there's far too much to grieve and our task will largely involve learning how to inhabit the unfixable. There are no easy solutions here, but there are more responsible and more sensible ways to live. I take hope in that, and I think that the faith traditions are uniquely positioned to contribute to this work. Thank you.
So thank you all. And I want to get to your questions, and I'm mindful of the clock as quickly as we can, but maybe if we could just have very quick, short answers to one sort of an opening question from me. And it's simply put, it's sort of, what the hell happened between 2015 and now? If you go back to 2015, when the Paris Accords were completed, the Obama administration sort of led the way and the world came together. You had the Pope's encyclical, Pope Francis, the Laudato Si, that came out. And there was a lot of excitement about that, churches talking about it, communities coming together. And it seemed to be there was this great momentum that was happening. And today, a scant 3.5 years later, we have an administration in our country that is actively in climate denial. But more important in some respects to me, looking at it as a journalist, is that, and this gets to the point that Greta Thunberg was making, that even the Swedens of the world are way behind in meeting the relatively modest commitments that were made in Paris, that there is not this momentum, that it has not happened. How did that happen? What was the role of faith communities, of political parties, of us as individuals? And how do we get back the sort of momentum that we thought we had several years ago? But short thoughts on that. If there's any quick answer. Yeah, go down the line. But we want to get to questions.
I'll be quick. I would just speak for faith communities. I think from my perspective, working across Georgia, is that there's a great need to educate and empower individuals and faith leaders on the ground to actually have tangible paths to act on something. And I think that what you're saying is there's sort of this global issue that happens in 2015. There are all these great agreements, but it doesn't seem like anyone did the hard work of investing and equipping grassroots communities to carry forward that work so that when there is a transition at the top, there is a great momentum of people who are educated about the issues, who have power, who know what the issues are, and who are committed to those moral things so that they are empowered to continue to work toward that. That's what.
But did you think, you were at the grassroots, you were working with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, you were working with these churches and other community groups. Did you feel like that things were moving and you must have been gobsmacked at some point that it didn't happen, that it all went into reverse?
I feel like, yes, I think things are happening, from my perspective, things are happening at the grassroots level more in faith communities than they were in 2015, would be my answer to that. And I think I'll just point back to what I said about prophetic imagination, is I think there is a great gap in what it means to stand in the public square as religious leaders and people of faith to claim that spot, that moral spot. And I think a lot of time has been spent fighting about facts and science, which we know doesn't actually change anyone's mind, but not speaking at this level of myth and religious commitment as well.
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge is devising ways to hold elites accountable. If you look at sort of the economy in a place like Norway, heavily dependent on natural gas, oil. How do you get folks to sort of divest from the very means that would seem to ensure their sense of survival? And so part of what will be required is really sort of a new imagination of what survival looks like. And it's tough to do that in a world where we don't have trust and buy-in and all the classical kind of challenges that affect political cooperation would then sort of arise.
So I think it's a great question, but I really want to think about the long term, because this is long term. This is the greatest challenge humans have ever had to deal with. My grandfather taught history at Columbia. He was a European historian. He was trying to get the history department to understand American history at that time. And even now, our departments are totally dominated by American history. His student went to the Second World War. All of our studies of Asian countries and traditions came out of the Second World War. I was a student of my grandfather's student. My first teaching job was on world history, which is now required in certain high schools and so on. We now have actually big history. What is it to tell the history of the evolution of universe and Earth and humans? That in a generational time span is, I think, a cause for hope. In other words, we are creating an Earth community, and we have a long, long way to go, and it's why culture and the understanding of it through religion and ethics and so on is hugely important. And I'll just say, finally, what's happening on local levels across the country, the number of mayors who have come on board making changes, we hear every week, almost every day at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, hopeful signs and challenging signs. But intergenerational justice, climate justice, these are right on the front lines. And I think that is really hopeful.
I won't ask for a show of hands here of how many people are climate change deniers, but one of the challenges for us as a journalism and education organization is that I really want us to be in rooms where there are lots of people who are denying what's happening, and sort of to engage them and have conversations. Why we put so much of our energy and resources into middle school and secondary school and community colleges and trying to get out into red state areas of the country, get away from Washington where I'm based, and engage people. We're starting an initiative now we call it connected communities, connected coastal communities, many of which happen to be in relatively conservative areas of the country, but they're near the water. They're experiencing extreme weather, and they're seeing it. They're seeing the sea levels rise. They're seeing the effect on their real estate, and I think there's a great opening there for doing reporting projects, maybe with some local Fox stations that are the main news source, that would get better quality reporting and sort of engage people in that issue. So, but I mean, maybe do one more quick round of thoughts like that. If given the extreme polarization in America today, and the fact that we are more and more in our own silos, we don't even really talk with our relatives who don't agree with us. It's very difficult to have these conversations. What would be quick thoughts, and then we'll turn to the audience, as to how do you bridge those kinds of divides and the roles that each of you play?
I think that the easiest way to move people is through relationships, their actual experience of something different. The way that I do my work in congregations and places that would never, I don't use the climate change, that phrase, often if I'm in a particular place, but what I can do is root it in a conversation about love of God and love of neighbor, and I can demonstrate how the changes in the environment or the inequities between communities are a cause for faith communities to get involved based on what they're already doing. And I think once they engage in that, you sort of do the intersectional work to show how all of these different justice issues are connected, then I think they can buy in a little bit more. I find that a lot of the pressure against the phrase climate change is bound up with a lot of political baggage, but especially in working class communities across this state and others, there's not a good conversation happening at any level about what a just transition would look like for people whose livelihoods depend on the structures that already exist, and especially in small towns across Georgia where mining or coal plants and things like that are maybe the only fabric of that society that holds them together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the denial is far deeper than just folks denying the evidence. I think that it's, as Mary Evelyn suggested, I think it's built into many of our cosmologies, so that we inhabit moral. I mean, I guess I'll say this out loud. But yeah, I mean, I went through 2 graduate programs and never really, both dealing with sort of ethics, politics, philosophy, religion, never really had to take an exam on environmental ethics at all. And that's over 8-9 years. It just wasn't a part of the curriculum. I think that's a major problem. And so part of what we're dealing with is built into our moral and religious traditions. We're essentially sort of unlettered in the language of the land. And so how do you galvanize the affections for that which you don't even have the language for?
That's a very good point about in terms of the role of the academy in this, and this is something where I think Yale has been a leader, and one of you might speak to the joint degree program that's started.
I was just going to. Did you finish your statement?
I was just warming up, but it's okay.
No, you go right ahead.
I'm
You go right ahead.
I'm done now. I'm okay.
That's why I like this guy. So, I think one of the issues of why we've been divided, polarized, first of all, we don't tell our history. My husband's a specialist in Native American history. Who had Native American history as we grew up, right? So we do not tell our history. All minorities have not yet been incorporated, in case we didn't notice. But secondly, if we take two of the great schools at Yale, the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, it's over 100 years old. It's created most of our great environmentalists and so leaders and so on. Up until fairly recently, it was all about the environment, nature, water, fisheries, conservation, and so on. People at the door. But if you take the Divinity School, social justice, especially thanks to Greg and people like Clifton and others, that is coming stronger and stronger. But up until fairly recently, the environment was a little bit over there. So we've got humans and then we've got nature in these two great schools. Now, thanks to the fact that Greg, again, with faculty, have spearheaded a master's in religion and ecology at the Divinity School, which is the only seminary in the country to have such a master's. I think it's extraordinary. Before that, the dean of the Divinity School and the dean of the Forestry School, Gus Beth and Harry Attridge, created a joint program between these two schools, which is a very important move. Again, there's no place in the country that has that. So that's a program that's over 12 years. These are programs that need to be supported and encouraged and scholarships for students and so on. But that's, I think, why we have some of the polarization. Education isn't up to speed. 2 PhDs, and not the environment. And that's true in many graduate programs at the best schools in the country. So this issue is the future of survival for all of us. Did you want to keep going, though? On your...
I'm good.
Okay.
So your questions. I think we have a microphone. Let's see. Greg's got the microphone. One over here, one over there.
I want to say really quickly while they're looking, the religions of the world are rediscovering their views of nature, their environmental ethics, retrieving, reevaluating, and reconstructing. And that's what we've been trying to do in the Forum on Religion and Ecology. That's a positive move forward, like dominion to stewardship, care for creation, and so on. That is what is happening. That's very powerful. New theological, ethical movements forward.
I hear, okay, we're doing this great thing at Yale, and we've got a new master's program that's finally going to get religion and environmentalism together, and certainly one must applaud that. But somehow when you look at the scope of the transition required, it's peanuts. And I think we all just need to recognize that we need to up our game in ways that are totally outside our comfort zone. And I don't think I'm doing that. I mean, even though I'm wake up every morning, what can I do about the climate crisis? And I'm doing active things. But the scope of, when somebody says, well, we need a World War II style mobilization, I think you're talking about the Battle of Britain. And I don't think we're reacting in the same way. We're sort of the proverbial frog in the pot. It's just happening. And just what do you? I don't know. That's just a comment. It's frustrating to me looking at this now for 5 years.
I think this is
pretty
something
intensely.
that Nathaniel Rich, for those of you who saw The Losing Earth, this full issue of the New York Times Magazine last summer, what Nathaniel was trying to do in that piece, and it's now going to be a book coming out next month, and then Apple's going to do a TV series based on it. But he's looking at the 1980s. He was making the case that we all blew it. That it wasn't just the oil companies. It wasn't just the Republicans. And it's very comforting, particularly on the left, for us to think that it was all their fault, that the facts were manipulated, and Nathaniel was really making, in large part, the same kind of argument that Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish girl, is making, is that we're living very carbon-heavy lives, every one of us. I never heard President Obama say that he did not want anything ever other than sustain economic growth, more GDP every year, and that's not sustainable. We're not going to be able to live that way, let alone if we think that India and China are going to be lived that way. But other thoughts?
Well, I really agree. But we've been working on this for 20 years on the religion and ecology side, and it is gaining traction. There's jobs all across the country in this. So we like to say it's a field, which us academics are working on, but it's a force. And this is why IPL is so important. And everything that we're trying to do is this dance of theory and praxis. We did 10 conferences at Harvard on this. People came from all over the world, 800 people. There's 10 books and so on. And I just want to give you one example. Look, I went into this because of Asia. I was in China and Japan in the early 70s. And if you think of what's happening, the changes are because of 1 billion people in each of those countries are looking for the fruits of modernity. So what is China doing about this? Well, in 2008, we met with the Deputy Prime Minister for the Environment in China, who had translated the books on Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism into Chinese because they're saying we need an environmental ethics based on our culture. Now, in the Constitution in China is a right to an ecological civilization and a healthy environment. And there are movements towards ecological civilization all across the country against great odds. The pollution is out of sight, as you all know. But the cultural shift is there. And I can give you other examples from Islam, from India, and so on. It's beginning to move. The rate of change is enormous. I totally agree.
We had a question on this side.
I'd like to lift up what I think is maybe some differences on the panel and ask a simple question. For what should we hope? Should we hope for the sustainability of the current political and economic system that we have? Or should we hope for the end of the world as we know it? And as Clifton Granby said, new ways of inhabiting the unfixable.
Well, yeah, I agree with everything you said. I take, in these times, hope isn't cheap. It doesn't come easy. But I do take hope in the history. When you look at freedom struggles and movements of the past, there were folks who labored and worked for a vision of the world that they themselves didn't get to see. And so this gets to the intergenerational, kind of what are you passing on to your children's children? And I take hope in the unfinished sort of nature of history itself. That is to say, Professor Catherine Tanner, in her new book, Christianity and the New Spirit of Capitalism, takes this up, which is sort of the way in which the ways in which our involvement in these wider economic sort of relationships of power and control, they discipline our very sense of time. So the way in which we even understand time is often reflective of what would help us be more productive workers on the job. And part of the way in which we become more efficient is from a very early age, we learn how not to even consider things that don't make us productive. And that whole logic is, in many ways, predicated on this idea of extracting goods, raw materials, whatever, from the earth, as opposed to dwelling or inhabiting and so forth, right? And so so first we have to sort of just, rethink how we even experience time by trying to track what our present social relations are doing to our sense of time. And then once you do that, I think other alternatives at least begin to open up, because you can say, well, what's possible isn't merely determined by what seems to be practical or by what seems to be possible based upon some future prediction, based upon some algorithm by the market, for example. So that future predictions aren't overdetermined by the present economic regime, which is largely how so many of us sort of experience forecasts and futures. And this is where the religious traditions are so helpful, because it's precisely this openness to that which is already but not yet.
One thing that gives me hope in our work in the global south and rainforests and elsewhere is that there is much more of an assertion of rights, of sort of looking at this issue in terms of individual and community rights, not just as a matter of sort of protecting a pristine environment for the rest of us. And I think that may be a way forward as people have more of a sense of the world as a shrinking space. There's much more communication. We're all aware, even in quite remote areas, of what others have, what the inequities are. There is a way forward, and that also brings us back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the civil rights movement and lots of other struggles in American and world history.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, certainly the human rights, the civil rights, learning from the past, women's rights and so on, these have been struggles. They're still ongoing, in case we didn't notice. But I think one of the newer movements is the rights of nature. Now that might sound far out, but about 5 years ago in Cochabamba in Bolivia, 30,000 people, largely native indigenous peoples from both the Americas, gathered to write the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Nature. It made it all the way to the General Assembly at the UN, was voted on, and so on. That movement, and it's quite widespread, I must say, has led to the rights of rivers in New Zealand, the rights of the Yamuna and Ganges in India. This past week, Toledo voted for the rights of Lake Erie. Okay, it's being argued over about the rights of the Colorado River and so on. This is also the kind of worldview shift, as Clifton referred to. What is it that's holding us if we can't have a sense that the whole Earth community is part of the discourse of rights? You see, it's not just property rights. It's not just our rights. That will not get us to a shared future. And there's no future without a shared future.
Your question about hope is a good one, I think. I take hope in history, but that's been well covered better than I could do it, so I won't say that. But I would say I am hopeful in people paying attention. I think the point about how do we hold elites accountable is a really good one. The system is designed in such a way that it's very difficult to track what's happening, and that if you do pay attention to what's happening, then you wake up and for 5 years you wonder, well, what can I do about the climate crisis today? And then you feel really bad when you don't recycle. And it's sort of a personal guilt thing. But the reality is about 100 companies produce 70 to 80% of our carbon. So there's a personal thing to be done. I don't want to say that that's not true, but part of it is paying attention and figuring out how to hold elites accountable and to produce policies and to get involved in the system that is designed to make sure that you don't get involved in it.
We're almost out of time, but maybe there are a couple of quick questions or comments, then we have the panelists have last thoughts. Maybe there's two there. Maybe we'll take both and then sort of see. Was there another one over here as well? Just both of those, then we'll address them.
It's occurred to me that while I'm just right now, that we don't have a leader like a Martin Luther King for this movement that is very percolating and very powerful at the grassroots, I think. It's growing. But where's the Martin Luther King or the Nelson Mandela? Is it because this problem is too big to have a leader, an inspirational leader that will do what Martin Luther King did? What are your opinions about that? Who are the potential leaders that you know of? I don't know of any that are of that level.
I just remind you that Martin Luther King was 26 years old when he was in Montgomery and started the bus boycott, sort of reluctantly pressed into leadership of that issue. And I have faith in people like Greta Thunberg, this young girl in Sweden that I was describing. I mean, I think the leaders, I think they are emerging. They are emerging, and they are seized with this issue.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. Thank you. All of these have been. So, it's not going to be one. It's going to be many. And partly because this is the great movement of inclusion of people whose voices have not been at the table in the room. And again, I come back to what's quite extraordinary is Indigenous peoples. Standing Rock was the largest gathering of Indigenous peoples in modern history. Thousands of people out there in North Dakota. My husband's from North Dakota. We know some of the issues there. This was extraordinary. That movement of young people who started it with rituals and ceremonies and nonviolence in the depths of winter with those cannons at them and so on. I mean, this is equal to the civil rights movement, right? But my point is, the voices of Indigenous peoples, which has exploded across the Americas, all of the linkages for environment, our Indigenous peoples are there in Canada, US, and Latin America. And I want to just offer this suggestion. John has referred to the Amazon. 2 years ago in Norway, the Norwegian government, with the United Nations Environment Program, has started and led, and they're meeting right on Monday, one of the most remarkable confluences of this movement with many leaders. And here's the confluence. It's saying Indigenous peoples understand the rainforest. They've lived there for hundreds and thousands of years. They understand traditional environmental knowledge. Their rituals are bound up with it. They must lead the voices for the recovery and conservation of these great ecosystems on the planet. But who's going to support those voices? The religious communities in the Amazon, in the Congo, and in Indonesia. So the Christian communities and so on. So this confluence is emerging. The Pope's encyclical is an extraordinary example of integral ecology of people and the planet with a critique that progress and economic growth can't continue in the same framework. And you know what? These are all broken institutions in certain ways. UN is imperfect. The Catholic Church is so imperfect. And yet, out of these institutions are emerging, I think, truly visionary programs and empowerment of many leaders. And I'll just end by saying the Sunshine Movement, 26 young people under 26 spent 1 year and a half studying nonviolent movements, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Thoreau, and so on. And these are the young people who are behind the Green New Deal and helping to make these changes happen. That comes from a spiritual, religious, nonviolent movement that's extraordinary. Some of them have been speaking at Yale lately. They are so powerful. It's quite amazing. They're emerging.
Clifton, Codi, final thoughts? Well, on that, thank you all for coming out for this. Thanks to the panelists for this great presentation. We've covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate your interest. The institution is broken. Certainly, American journalism is in free fall at the moment. So we're trying to figure out a way to reach the kind of public that we used to take for granted in cities across the country. And all of us are sort of trying to, in whatever institutions, communities, church groups, schools, you name it, we have to come together and figure out a way that we can address collectively the big challenges that we face. But I come back to Greta Thunberg, and I hope you will go home and watch that 10-minute TED Talk, because it will inspire you, because that is a 16-year-old who has her eye on the challenge that generation is going to have to meet, and hopefully they can galvanize enough of us old people to follow in their lead. So.
And I just want to say, let's support Interfaith Power and Light. Let's
Yes.
support the new rising ethicists in seminaries and so on. And for further information, there's some flyers out there. And I really want to thank our dean again, Greg, and Gail and Chris, the two Sawyers, and so many people hosting us here tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.